Hi, folks. My name is Suraj Uttamchandani. I'm a doctoral candidate here in the IU Learning Sciences program, and I use he, him, his pronouns. Um, I'm here to talk to you today about assessment and learning with a special attention to assessment in your student teaching and in your EdTPA and kind of what that means for supporting better teaching and learning practices. So let's start by thinking about an actual assessment question. Jack has 24 fish. He puts them into 4 bowls. Each bowl has an equal number of fish. How many fish are in each bowl? A, 4, B, 6, C, 8, or D, 20? Now, hopefully you can actually do the answer to this question. So let's instead focus on how the question is written. Consider if we change the choices to be A0, B6, C, fish, or D100. Now the answer is sort of obvious. And so you, the teacher, can make a lot less meaningful conclusions about what students know if they answer this question correctly than this one. So assessment matters, and how you construct assessments matter, and how the assessment is aligned to your instruction matter. So let's get into it. What is an assessment? Well, we can start with some examples that probably are familiar to you, I would hope. Tests, multiple choice tests, constructed response tests, essay exams, presentations, quizzes, practicals like lab reports, worksheets that you collect, portfolios, don't mind me, portfolios, essays, standardized tests like the SAT, iLearn, or AP test, exit tickets. These kinds of things all should be familiar to you as an assessment. So let's get into what a kind of formal definition. Educational assessment is a formal attempt to determine student status with respect to educational variables of interest. I say formal because it needs to be the case that every student has an equal opportunity to participate in the assessment. So formality matters. Now I could look at you and I could say, oh, you look bored, and maybe I might change my instruction accordingly because I've gotten some new information about you, but that wasn't formal. Even though it's important to be responsive to your students and kind of know and make sense of what they look like, it's the formality that really makes something an assessment. When I say educational variables of interest, I'm thinking about the most common one as being like students' knowledge, right? Students' mathematical knowledge, students' scientific knowledge, students' reasoning. But we could also measure students' views on a topic, student self-efficacy, those kinds of things. And we want to determine student status with respect to those variables. So we want to be able to place a student somewhere and say, oh, this student is quite strong relative to their understanding of the times tables, or relatively wanting more help or needing more assistance. Okay, so why bother assessing? What is assessment good for? Well, it's so that you can base your decisions on something besides whether or not you've had enough coffee that day. This is actually, I'm joking, obviously, but this is a serious thing, is that when we make decisions about how we want to work with our students or how we might want to work with future students, we should base those decisions in something. So here's some real things. We can use assessment to determine students' initial status, right? Before instruction, we can say, oh, what do the students already know about this topic? What can we assume about their prior engagement with the topic? We can monitor progress, right? Halfway through a unit, we can say, okay, so where are we? How are we doing halfway through? How are we progressing? Assigning grades. For the moment, we assign grades to students. Usually those grades should be based on something rather than like how you feel about the student, right? So assessments can be really useful for basing your grades on something. Determining a teacher's own instructional effectiveness. You can be teaching this marvelous unit, think you're doing a great job, and at the end of the unit, you give students an assessment and you find out that they don't really understand the topic. Now you might say, oh, maybe I should do something different next time. And assessments can also clarify teachers' instructional intentions. They can kind of show students what matters to you. Assessments tell students, oh, this is what the teacher really cares about. This is what I was supposed to kind of take away from the unit. This is what I should focus on as I work my way through this topic. Also important are that assessments can influence the public's perception of how education is going in society, and assessments can be used to help evaluate teachers, like the EdTPA. But for now, I'm focusing on these 5 in black. Take a moment, pause the video, and think about the following. Can you come up with an example of something that is not an assessment? Something that maybe you're getting information about the student, or maybe you're kind of doing something assessment like, but it's not an assessment, and I've copied the definition that we talked about earlier just down here in the bottom left corner. Please choose something that maybe some people might think is an assessment, and you're going to show them that it's actually not. So for example, I know that a calculator is not an assessment, but I'm talking about something, some kind of instructional activity. Then can you come up with something that is an assessment, but maybe isn't a good assessment or isn't actually doing a good job? Pause the video, take a moment, and see if you can come up with examples of these. Did you pause it? I'm assuming you paused it. I'm just going to give you the benefit of the doubt. So, what's something that's not an assessment? Well, for example, something like a class discussion is not an assessment because it doesn't have that formal thing and it doesn't let me really rigorously kind of make sense of where students are at or measure student status, right? Class discussions are great. I think they're totally worth doing and I super support them, but I wouldn't categorize them as assessments. Then can we come up with an example of something that is an assessment but isn't like good at being an assessment? Well, for example, if I was trying to make sense of whether or not students could engage in real world problem solving using mathematics, a series of multiple choice calculation problems wouldn't be a great way to do that. However, if I wanted to know if students could make those calculations, those arithmetic calculations, then of course that assessment would be good. So there is this alignment question, which brings us to a point. Not everything has to be an assessment. It's an important point, and I'll phrase it again in a slightly more professional way. A deliberate assessment ecosystem is much better than a lot of assessment garbage. So, for example, you can, as talked about before, look at a student and say, oh, that student doesn't look like they're following. I should probably change my instruction. I should probably repeat what I said. I should do something differently. That's really good. That's some great teaching. You're being responsive to your students. You're making sense of where you think they are and kind of changing what you're doing accordingly. Great. But let's not call that an assessment. Not everything you do has to be an assessment. It's better to be really deliberate and smart about what your assessments are than try and assess all over the place all the time in a half-hearted way. Now, that also points to the fact that yes, not everything's an assessment, but also there are plenty of things that are great assessments for some uses and not great for other uses. So how can we figure out what a good assessment is? Quality assessments. Quality assessments are aligned to instructional goals. If your goals were for students to make sense of the book A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, then the SAT is probably not a great measure of that. So your assessment should be aligned to your goals. They should be aligned to your learning theory, right? If you are a behaviorist and you really care about students' performing behavior, then some kind of essay assessment that asks them to engage in critical thinking about something new isn't really aligned to how you're thinking about learning. Also, you shouldn't be thinking about learning that way, but that's a different topic. Should be aligned to the content. That's similar to being kind of aligned to instructional goals, right? Your assessment should be fair, it should be unbiased, it should be equitable, it should not be racist. And what this really means in practice, right, is that the assessment shouldn't be measuring something that isn't relevant to the thing it's trying to measure. So if the assessment uses a bunch of vocabulary words that are irrelevant to the content at hand, then you're kind of unfairly disadvantaging those who maybe don't have knowledge of those words, which kind of colors your assessment information in a problematic way. So yes, so your assessment shouldn't be racist, they shouldn't be sexist, they shouldn't be heterosexist, they should be fair, they should be unbiased and equitable. They should be appropriately timed. You can have this wonderful essay assessment, but if you only give students 6 minutes to do it, guess what? Not a good assessment, even if it would have been wonderful if you had given students an hour. And kind of most importantly, well, maybe not most importantly, but very important is that assessment should be useful for making decisions. If your assessment isn't giving you information that is helpful for making decisions like about what you might do in class the next day, or with a different group of students the next time you teach this material, or for assigning grades to students or giving feedback, then maybe it's not a great assessment. These are important things to keep in mind. I just want to kind of remind you about assessment ecosystems briefly, right? So multiple choice questions are great for really efficient testing of a wide variety of topics in a really narrow way. And then something like portfolios or performance assessments allow you to go pretty deep, but won't necessarily cover as much. So balancing various kinds of assessments can be really fruitful. Now, for the rest of our time together, I'm going to encourage you to work through a few examples. So let's start with this one. What, if any, are the errors in this item? It's an 11th grade essay. Based on the 10-week unit of study on the three branches of government that our class has just concluded, please indicate whether you believe the legislative, executive, or judicial branch is most powerful. Defend your choice as persuasively as you can, relying on relevant arguments and evidence. Please do so in 500 words or less. Your response will count for 1/3 of this test's total points, and you should spend no more than 30 minutes composing your response. Pause the video now and see what kinds of errors you could find in this item, and what kinds of questions do you have about what's happened in the classroom that will help you answer how you feel the quality of this assessment is? Pause the video and think through the quality of this assessment item. Did you pause? Okay, welcome back. So I think there's kind of two answers here. Firstly, I would say that on the whole, this is a strong item. It's well written, and it covers a lot of the information that students need to know, and it's clear what students are being asked. In terms of whether or not it's high quality, you would need to know a little bit more about what's happening in the classroom. So, for example, you would kind of want to know what kinds of activities students had been doing in class and whether or not this assessment is appropriately aligned to what the teacher had been thinking through. Okay, next question. Miss Peacock teaches 4th grade. Over the course of the year, she wants students to become more skilled writers, specifically consistent with the central focus of using appropriate referencing materials and revising to improve writing. Which approach best supports her goals? And before I show you the approaches, I just want to point out that this is an instructional goal that's aligned to some Indiana state standards around literacy at the 4th grade level. So which of these three assessments best supports her goals? A portfolio-style assessment where students evaluate their own work samples and resubmit them. B, a series of essay-style exams where students are asked to respond to a specific piece of literature they read in class. C, a series of presentations where students explain their views on class readings. Pause the video and think through not only which of these three is best, if any of them is better than the others, but also why. Why in terms of quality assessments. Pause the video and think this through now. All right, welcome back. I think that C is definitely out. Presentations where students are explaining their views on class readings are not at all aligned to this central focus, even a little bit. So that's definitely out. I think B could be really powerful. But I think A is the answer here. I think A is the best approach. And the reason for that is because Miss Peacock wants to evaluate students' ability to revise, to improve their writing. And while B does maybe show us if students can use appropriate reference materials, A is really the only one that allows us to think about revising, because it allows students to resubmit their work. So that's that alignment piece that is what's going to make A a really powerful assessment. Now note that if Miss Peacock wanted to do this all in 20 minutes, then a portfolio is not a good idea. So you would want her to have thought about this portfolio idea from the beginning of the semester and really been intentional and deliberate about it. Okay, let's just do one more quick question. Miss Scarlett, who teaches 5th grade, wants to assess if students are able to engage in historical thinking. After their unit on the Revolutionary War, where they reviewed and made sense of primary sources, she wants to quickly know that students have learned the content through a historically rich lens. Which would be most appropriate and why? A, a test containing short constructed response items in which students respond to real documents. B, an independent research project where students turn in a paper on a topic of their choosing related to the war. And C, a test containing multiple choice factual questions about the Revolutionary War. Pause the video and decide which you think is most appropriate and why. Welcome back. What do you think? I would say C is not a bad choice here. C certainly is quick, but it maybe isn't as helpful for seeing if students can kind of make sense of primary sources, which is what Miss Scarlett is looking for. That's kind of what she means when she's talking about historically rich lenses, kind of getting students to think like historians. So C is kind of on the table, maybe a little bit. B could be really good for helping see if students can make sense of primary sources. But A, it isn't actually going to test students' knowledge of the topics that were covered in class. It's going to test their knowledge on kind of other topics. So it's got this historically rich lens part, but maybe not if they've learned the content. And so I think A is the right answer here. And I want to highlight that Ms. Scarlett wants to know this quickly. Maybe she only has one day, one 40-minute block in which she can kind of do this assessment. Now, if she maybe had a week, she could structure B to maybe achieve these goals. So this idea of quickly is part of what's aligned here. This is what I mean by an assessment ecosystem, making sure that the assessment fits right on in and is aligned to everything else that's happening in the classroom. So that's kind of a brief overview for you of what educational assessment is, why it's useful, and how you know if you've done a high quality assessment. What I want you to take away from this is across the board, really strong and high quality assessment practices are going to fundamentally support student learning. They're going to give you lots of information that you can act on, and they're also going to help students kind of crystallize their knowledge and make sense of things. All right, good luck out there.